everyone doing? We're good? All right. So I want to begin with a story that Toni Morrison shares when delivering her speech while receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993, okay? So she opens this speech telling the story about an old woman. This woman is old, but she is also wise. And Morrison acknowledges that this is a folk narrative that could exist both in the way her imagination, but it could also exist in other folk narratives. And so she acknowledges that this individual could be male, this individual could be of a different race, but in her imagination for this particular narrative, this old woman is black, and she is the descendant of slaves here in America. And what Morrison says is that there are some young people that go into the old woman's home, and they go to the woman. Now, what's critical to know about this woman is that she is old, she is wise, and she is blind. And so the young people go into her home and they say to the old woman, "Is the bird in my hand living or dead?" The old woman does not respond to the young people. I mean, to the point where it is obnoxious and awkward. Why is she sitting there silently, blind, not responding? The young people then begin to laugh at the old woman, articulating that she has no power, no relevance. They're really coming into her home because they're wanting to prove that the old woman has no power, has no relevance. It's said that this old woman is clairvoyant. And so the young people are in her house asking her, "Is the bird in my hand living or dead?" Eventually, the old woman says, "I don't know. I don't know if the bird is living or dead. What I do know is that the bird is in your hands." Morrison then proceeds to articulate that the bird in this analogy for the remainder of her speech, the bird is language. And her hands are that of a skilled writer. And Morrison causes us to really think, ponder, and ask the question, is language dead? Dead not just in the sense that there are dead languages, meaning that there are languages that are no longer spoken in particular communities, but dead in the sense that does it still hold its power? And Morrison says, yes, it in fact does still hold its power. And Morrison believes that language has the power both to construct the world that we live in and to destroy that very same world. There is a quote that I want to share with you from the speech. She says, "The systematic looting of language can be recognized by the tendency of its users to forgo its nuanced, complex, midwifery properties for menace and subjugation. Oppressive language does more than represent violence, it is violence. Does more than represent the limits of knowledge, it limits knowledge. Whether it is obscuring state language or the faux language of mindless media, whether it is the proud but calcified language of the academy or the commodity-driven language of science, whether it is the malign language of law without ethics or language designed for the estrangement of minorities, hiding its racist plunder in its literary cheek, it must be rejected, altered, and exposed. It is the language that drinks blood, laps vulnerabilities, tucks its fascist boots under crinolines of respectability and patriotism as it moves relentlessly toward the bottom line and the bottomed out mind. Sexist language, racist language, theistic language are all typical of the policing languages of mastery and do not permit new knowledge or encourage the mutual exchange of ideas." In other words, Morrison is suggesting that our language is what has created our racist policies. It is what has created our sexist policies. It is what causes certain people to be marginalized on the periphery. The totality of our understanding of discrimination is linked to the language that we use. And our ability to dismantle systems of oppression is also attached to both exposing this language and constructing and creating new language that is not oppressive. In other words, the bird is in our hands. And so as we talk this evening, this afternoon, we're going to be thinking about some words. The way that words offend, the way that words have troubled some, the history of the meaning and significance behind words, how words are gathered together and understood in community. And while we are doing that, the entire time I want you to see yourself as Morrison told in that story. I want you to see yourself as the old woman and the bird is in your hands. Whether the bird is living or the bird is dead, by the end of our time together, you should understand that the more important reality is that the bird is in your hands. When I was studying English literature, are there any English majors in the room? By any chance? Oh, yay. A couple of us. I was pursuing a PhD in English literature at one point in my life, and so I got to teach English literature at UMD College Park for a little bit. And so we are going to go into my nerd phase, and that is that of linguistic and literary theory. Stick with me because it is going to make sense in a little bit. There is a linguistic theorist by the name of Ferdinand de Saussure. He is the individual who we credit to be the theorist attached to semiotic theory. And in his most infamous work, the work that if you were an English major, you would be required to read maybe in your junior or senior year, you would be reading a course in linguistics, a general course in linguistics. That's what it was called. And in this, Saussure suggests that there are 4 characteristics of language, 4 very important characteristics of language. The first is that language is a well-defined object in the heterogeneous mass of speech. It is, in fact, the social side of speech. The second characteristic of language is that it is unlike speaking. So, Saussure is trying to make a very important distinction. When we are studying the scientific method of language, we are not studying that of speech. We are studying that of language. And we're going to talk a little bit about that distinction in a little bit, right? So Saussure is saying that unlike speaking, language is something that can be studied separately. The third characteristic, language is a system of signs in which the only essential thing is the union of meanings and sound images. Now, this is important because what this basically means for a couple of us is that the word, for instance, giraffe, the only reason the word giraffe has any meaning is because it is attached to the sign or the sound image that is the very animal that came to your mind when I articulated that word, correct? So when I say the word giraffe, we are all thinking about the same animal. When I say the word elephant, you are all thinking about the same animal. Where the conversation gets controversial and very fascinating is when we use words that have double meanings, all right? Particularly in the English language. Many of your friends who come to the States to study will tell you English is the hardest language to learn because there's so many instances where one word can mean something and it completely means something else in a different context, right? So it'd be one thing to say the word race. Race, as we know, could mean NASCAR, or it could mean, as we typically, and we'll talk about a little bit later, the social construction that is our racialized system and thus our method of categorization, right? So words only have meaning, what Sarasura is saying, words only have meaning when their signs are attached to a sound image, okay? And then the fourth very important characteristic is that language is a storehouse of sound images, and writing is the tangible form of those images, all right? So, in essence, language is both social and it is psychological, meaning that language is made in community. It is understood in community. The words and the sound images are gathered by groups of people, and those words are also psychological, meaning that they have been gathered in the mind. They are attached to emotions, belief systems. They are attached to social norms, histories, products, and policies. So that, in other words, if you don't remember anything else from tonight, you will remember that language is created in community. Meaning is created in community. And what a word means is deeply connected to the community that is articulating that word. Does that make sense? So that's an important foundation that we want to lay down. And it is why we want to mention my dear friend. I don't know him. I just liked him when I was studying. My good friend, Stanley Fish. Stanley Fish is also another literary theorist that we love to teach. And Dr. Fish came up with an important term called interpretive communities. If you are here for extra credit, I am giving you all of the goods, okay? Interpretive communities is critical because what Dr. Fish basically suggests is that, like I said, all meaning, all significance, all words is birthed and made in community. Furthermore, Fish suggests that we cannot interpret any written text apart from the interpretive community that we belong to. So that Fish actually believes that we bring meaning to texts long before we allow the text to actually tell us what it potentially means. That our socioeconomic status, our race, our religion, where we grew up in the world. Adrian and I went to a very small Christian college in Southwest Michigan. If I told you the name of the town, you would have never even heard of it. But in that very small community, we had a variety of experiences so that there is language that Adrian and I could use that you would have never heard of, right? So that when we approach a text, there are experiences that are attached to the region, attached to the race, attached to the religion, attached to the totality of our being that are impacting how we read, impacting what words mean. He says, interpretive communities are made up of those who share interpretive strategies, not for reading in the conventional sense, but for writing texts, for constituting their properties and assigning their intentions. In other words, these strategies exist prior to the act of reading and therefore determine the shape of what is read rather than as is usually assumed the other way around. So I want you to be thinking about this, particularly once we get to the end and we get to discuss, right? There are words in our society that we use that we bring meaning to, and thus there are meanings that exist within our interpretive communities that do not exist in others. I'll give you an example because Dr. Pierman and Adrian brought this up in the poll. They brought up the N-word. They specifically said to get your feelings, thoughts, and opinions on the N-word, ending in A and not ER. This is a very critical distinction because these are two very different words. And if the word ending in A is used in one particular interpretive community, then that interpretive community is using it as a term of endearment. The moment that that word shifts and there is a hard ER at the end, immediately that word is now from a different interpretive community and is being used as a means to demean and to dehumanize. So again, I want you to ever think about the way that interpretive communities determines what words mean and their significance. Meaning and significance are determined in community. Language is constructed in community. This is what I really want to drive home today. Now, let's go to the language of race. I'm going to try to do this quickly because I want us to chat. So the language of race. I had the privilege of studying in Tanzania for about 30 days in undergrad. I went there, and the moment that I landed, my white earth science professor said to me, "Claudia, how are you feeling now that you're back on the continent of Africa?" Back is these are great reactions. I love this. Yes. Now, everyone, my family is from Chicago. And my parents' family is from Georgia. And their family is also from the South. There is no voluntary immigration in my line that I know of, other than the fact that I have recently found out that my grandfather's grandfather was a full-blown Jew. Very fascinating. Love it. Looking into that a little bit some more. That's a little personal. Okay? Other than that, though, I have no idea where in Africa my people hail from originally. Okay? So while there, we got to spend some time with the Maasai people. We got to spend some time in the Bantu villages. We had a phenomenal time. And what was most fascinating to me was when we went into the Bantu villages, one of the elder men came up to me and proceeded to call me a white woman. Shock, 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 shock. Shock on me as well. How in the world am I a white woman? He proceeds to explain to me that their language and system of caste in Tanzania is not the same system as America. So that the only people in Tanzania that are allowed to be considered black are the Sudanese, because they are so black, their gums are black. So that the Sudanese are the only black people. A woman like you, what's your name? Sivian? Sivian, what's your name? Lorianne, what's your name? Jasmine. The three of you would be considered red. And myself, what's your name? Bugashi. Myself and Bugashi would be considered white. Again, because their interpretive community has created a completely different system of race, this lends itself to the absurdity of race and the social construction that it is. However, we are in America, so let us deal with the language of race within our context. I like to teach about race because race is a globally determined system of categorization that dates to the transatlantic slave trade. And what is most fascinating to me about the transatlantic slave trade, has anyone here heard about the doctrine of discovery? Anybody? Oh, I'm having a great night. There is a Pope, Pope Pius X, wrote a papal bull, that is an edict, for the King of Portugal in the 1490s. And during this time, what that papal bull articulated was that they had the right, the power, and the ability to go into foreign lands, to invade, to take the dominions, kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, to make the persons there perpetual slaves, to ultimately try to convert them to Christianity. And this is the beginning of colonialism. So that I like telling the story because colonialism begins with the Portuguese. It does not begin with Great Britain. It's important for us to tell all of the stories, right? So, as the transatlantic slave trade expands, Great Britain joins in on the fun. Once we get to the point where America is really economically benefiting off of a free labor force, what is happening during this time is not only are Africans being sold into slavery, but so are the Irish being used as slaves and indentured servants. And during this time, what the Irish would do, because at this moment, race is based on religion. Race is based on whether or not you are a Protestant Christian or you are a Catholic. The Irish were now becoming Protestant Christians. They were converting. And at this time, this early Christian church, Protestant Christian church, believed that you could not enslave Christians. So now they're wondering, what are we going to do now that we are losing our free labor source to all of these Irish persons becoming a Christian? How then are we going to get exploited labor? So now begins this construction of race based on the phenotype, based on what you look like on the outside. And so now we've got Thomas Carlyle, who is creating what we would call pseudoscience, where he is measuring the shape of the skull, and he's seeking to assert that there are Asiatic and African skulls that are inherently inferior. And this is going out in medical research. And then while we're doing that, we also have Ralph Waldo Emerson publishing what is known as English traits. Again, I am giving you gems. Tell your English teacher you learned about English traits. Ralph Waldo Emerson. When you read that, it's going to blow your mind because Ralph writes in English traits that the Anglo-Saxon man is best fit for marriage. He's best fit for civility, for college, for clergy and religion. And what Emerson is doing is he's asserting a certain kind of culture, race, and gender, I want to be clear, and gender, as being superior and having greater humanity than others. Included in the others for Ralph Waldo Emerson is the Germans, Asians, Africans. He spells out how these individuals do not have the intellectual constitution for politics. They do not have the intellectual constitution for marriage, education, religion. And so again, why is this important? Because race is a construction that has also erased that of the history of white people. In order for white people to become white, they had to cease to become German, they had to cease to become Polish, Italian, Jewish, and Irish. So, what do we see? We see, over an extended period of time, slowly but surely, the categorization of whiteness expands to include more than just the Anglo-Saxon male. But in its original creation, it was exclusively for the Anglo-Saxon male, right? So then slowly the Italian becomes white. Slowly the Jewish person becomes white. Slowly the German becomes white. The Irish become white, right? Now, this is important to note because I don't know if you all will remember this, but in 2020, there was some conversation around trying to get the Middle Eastern North Africans to be categorized as white on the census. Anybody remember that? Mm-hmm. And all the Middle Eastern, Northern African people were like, when and where have I ever been treated as a white person? I don't, quote unquote, look white. I've never been treated white. So I'm not going to check this box when every time I go into an airport, I am not treated this way. So it ends up falling there, not included in the categorization of whiteness. But that is a contemporary example to show you, right, that this meter has always been changing since the 1600s. It has been slowly working to expand the language and representation of who is included within it, that of whiteness, and who is included on the outside of it. All right? So race becomes a codified system of classification and categorization for the purpose of militaristic and imperial advancement, but also for economic exploitation. And so what's important is that the language of race is constructed, created, and articulated in the 1600s, and it is ever evolving over time, even into the 21st century. Okay? So, Isabel Wilkerson, who here has read the book Caste?
I'm reading it.
You're reading it right now? Wonderful. It's one of my favorite books. I know that the film Origin is out right now as well. I have not seen that yet, but if you want to, you really should go and see Origin. It's in theaters right now. Okay? Isabel Wilkerson, The Origin of Our Discontent. She writes, throughout human history, 3 caste systems have stood out. The tragically accelerated, chilling, and officially vanquished caste system of Nazi Germany, the lingering, millennia-long caste system of India, and the shape-shifting, unspoken, race-based caste pyramid in the United States. Each version relied on stigmatizing those deemed inferior to justify the dehumanization necessary to keep the lowest ranked people at the bottom and to rationalize the protocols of enforcement. A caste system endures because it is often justified as divine will, originating from sacred text, or the presumed laws of nature reinforced throughout the culture and passed down through the generations. So what I just explained to you, right? The divine nature is that papal bull from Pope Pius X. The laws of nature is the pseudoscience of Thomas Carlyle, measuring the shape of skulls, right? These are examples of how caste systems use science, philosophy, theology as a means to create language, and we ultimately live by and are impacted by that language, because then we get a constitution that suggests that African peoples are 3/5 of a human being. Right? Then we get amendments, policies, rules that determine that because of our inherent criminalization, we are deserving of particular treatment. Right? Language is constructing our society as we know and understand it. And that language, as a reminder, is being constructed in community. It is not being constructed in isolation. Right? The American community, its politicians, its presidents, its law enforcement, and its citizens are all impacted by and participating in this interpretive community that is the language of race. Now, because of the language of race, and you have a host of people in this country who are being boxed in and restricted and confined and treated in dehumanizing ways, what we also get in this beautiful country is the language of resistance, right? So that what we see, particularly from someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, is a lifelong catalog that is committed to revealing what it means to be black in America, what that experience is, attach language to the dehumanization, but then also what are ways to right this wrong, right? Now, one of the most famous works of W.E.B. Du Bois is The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. The Souls of Black Folk is a compilation of 9 essays published between 1897 and 1901. He's publishing them in The Nation, the American Historical Review, the Atlantic Monthly, World's Work, the Dial, and the Annals of the American Academy of Social and Political Science. And what he does is he pulls all of these essays together, and he does a little bit of rewriting, a little bit of reworking, and then he republishes them as this compilation in 1903. Now, post-Cold War, late 1940s, 1950s, what we see is the language of civil rights, the language of equality, is equated to communism. All right? This is particularly important because if there are any history majors in the room? No? Listen, you need to make a history major friend. A history major would let you know that America during the late 1940s and 50s was so afraid of communism due to World War II and the Cold War. They were afraid of McCarthyism and the infiltration of these communist ideals and fear of another dictator, aka Joseph Stalin, right? So there is this aversion to communism. And what our dear friend J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI end up doing is they suggest that the civil rights movement and any articulation of egalitarianism, equality, is merely an attack against American democracy, and it is an attack against capitalism. And so because of that, the civil rights movement becomes a political, economic, and militaristic threat to the American government. You're looking at me shocked. Listen, you ready? Get ready for the next slide, okay? So that what we see, right? J. Edgar Hoover proceeds to open FBI files on just about every single one of your favorite African American authors. I'm not talking about the leaders. We know that he opened a file on Malcolm X. We know he was spying on Martin Luther King. But I'm sure you did not know that there's an FBI file on Langston Hughes. There's an FBI file on James Baldwin, on Zora Neale Hurston, on playwright Lorraine Hansberry. I mean, Lorraine Hansberry, her only published work is A Raisin in the Sun. And J. Edgar Hoover has an FBI file on Lorraine. Okay? So why is this important? Why is this important? Because, like we're talking about, I want to kind of create a historical picture for you. Okay? Communism is being equated with the civil rights movement. So that even though all they're asking for is equality, all they're asking for is desegregation, what it seems like maybe in our contemporary language, all they're asking for is inclusion. So in the request for inclusion, because power desires to maintain its position, it has to create a narrative that suggests that what is actually being asked for is of greater government, economic, and democratic threat than it potentially actually is. So I'm assigning, right? We've got another interpretive community here that is assigning new meaning to the phrase civil rights. We've got an interpretive community that is suggesting that if you are for civil rights, if you use terms like equality, you are in favor of a leadership akin to that of Joseph Stalin. That is not what we were fighting for between the 1950s and the 1970s. But that's the language that's being attached to it, all right? So, because I'm a nerd, here are just some images of FBI files here for you. So let me see. This one is for James Baldwin. This one here on the far right. This one is for novelist Ooh, well that's cool.
You might be able to zoom out again if you just tap it. There we go.
I should not be this distracted. Okay, that's great. First of all, this is for novelist Dorothy Parker. Okay, novelist. All right. Now, this is one for MLK that I wanted to show you because what you see in the subject matter here is it says security matter communist. And this FBI file proceeds to explain that because King is holding the company of supposed communists, again, this is all presumed. Hoover and his team have not confirmed that these people are in fact communists, okay? So because they think that King is keeping company with communists, King has now become a security matter, right? This is a wonderful book that was published by the Princeton University Press called FBI's. And in this work, this Dr. Maxwell actually studies almost 14,000 pages of FBI files and finds that the FBI was following, tracking 51 black authors, poets, playwrights, all right? Yes, he was also tracking the Black Panther Party, but we, I think, are comfortable in our imagination thinking about the FBI tracking the Black Panther Party because of their aesthetic, the black leather, the rifles, the staunch call for self-defense, even though that is oftentimes read and interpreted as offensive violence, right? So because we have an image in our mind about what the Black Panther Party was and the story that we have been told about them, we are more comfortable saying, yes, they probably were a security threat in the government's mind, and so they were being followed. No. Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay was being followed. Jazz artists were being followed. All right? So the Harlem Renaissance dates between the mid-late 1920s, early 1930s. So think about this. That means the FBI has been tracking, creating FBI files on African American authors and artists since the 1920s. This does not begin in the late 1960s. All right? So, because the FBI and the American imagination was so anti-communism during this time, we also had black authors who were intentionally trying to put out works that distinguished themselves and differentiated themselves from communism as a language and from communism as a party. So what we have here, published in 1951 by Zora Neale Hurston, is Why the Negro Won't Buy Communism. An article that she basically says, here, despite the high-pressure selling of the Paul Robesons, the Benjamin Davises, and the Howard Fasts, the American Negro is too smart to fall for Joe Stalin's brand of up-to-date slavery. This is good, right? Because this is the kind of public propaganda that Black authors were forced to engage in so that they could simultaneously speak about the equality of rights for Black people, but still needing to explicitly say, hey, I don't subscribe to communism. Now, in 1967, Ezra Taft Benson, anybody heard of this guy? Yeah, me neither. Ezra Taft Benson was the 13th president of the Church for Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but he also was a former U.S. Secretary for Agriculture. And Mr. Benson here articulated, quote, "There is no doubt that the so-called civil rights movement as it exists today is used as a communist program for revolution in America, just as agrarian reform was used by the communists to take over China and Cuba." He articulates this in a speech, October 1967. Why is this important? Because Mr. Benson is not the only person who believed that the civil rights movement was not subconscious, but a subtle form of communism seeking to infiltrate the American system and take over. All right? So that in the same way that we have the civil rights, that term, civil rights, being equated to communism, we also get the term now woke. Woke comes into being in the 1940s, but it gets particularly popularized in the 1970s. There were jazz musicians who were using the phrase "stay woke." And in the 1940s, it was really, again, another word, restricted to interpretive communities that are exclusively African American. So African Americans are using the phrase "stay woke" in the 1940s because they're thinking about Jim Crow. They are thinking about lynching. They are thinking about the violence and inequities and injustices that are taking place in their communities. And so they're saying to a moderate, neutral, very educated Black community member, stay woke. Why? Because sometimes in Black communities, when you get a little bit of education and you get a little bit of money and you get a little bit of position, now you do not want to take the kinds of socio-political risks that are necessary for the whole. So the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr., there were many Black people that did not support King. He did not have a high approval rating during this time. So that the way that we remember King now, this romanticized view of him, did not actually exist during the time when he was actually doing his work. So that you had moderate whites and you had moderate Blacks who were not really working to fight for Black equality, all right? And so what the artists and the jazz musicians and this playwright named Barry Beckham articulate is a statement that is directed to Black people. This stay woke statement is not being directed to whites. It is directed to Black folks saying stay woke. Meaning be aware, be conscious. Do not allow your situation to paralyze you or pacify you into no longer engaging and propelling this important work of justice. In 1971, the playwright Barry Beckham writes a play entitled Garvey Lives, and he's talking about Marcus Garvey. Who here has heard of Marcus Garvey? couple of people. Marcus Garvey, he's another phenomenal person. You've got a couple of days of Black History Month left. Google him. That is going to be a treasure trove for you, okay? Because I can guarantee you, you were never taught about Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was the originator, the godfather of Pan-Africanism, and he was trying to get Black people, Black Americans, to choose to go back and create an independent Black state in Liberia. But that's a little quick story. I want you to Google. Now, Barry Beckham, in the play, he writes a line that says, "I've been sleeping all my life, and now that Mr. Garvey done woke me up, I'm going to stay woke, and I'm going to help him wake other Black folk. Wake up other Black folk." So that this is the interpretive community. This is the language. This is the imagination amongst Black people, that I must become conscious about my own history. I must become conscious about where I come from, about who I am, about the contributions of other Black folk. That's what stay woke means. Stay woke means be conscious about Blackness and the beautiful contributions that it has made to this country. Stay woke gets politicized in 2014 after the killing of Michael Brown. Michael Brown was the young man who was shot by police officers in Ferguson, Missouri, and left in the street for 4.5 hours right next to an apartment complex, rotting and dying, uncovered, just bleeding in the street. Many people at this point begin to articulate, we need to stay woke, both stay woke for the consciousness of Blackness and Black people, but also stay woke as a means of survival. Are you aware of your surroundings? Are you aware of how you are coming off to other people? You need to stay woke so that you can stay alive, okay? In 2013, Trayvon Martin is killed by George Zimmerman in Florida, and that is when the hashtag Black Lives Matter from Patrisse Cullors goes viral. All she says is, I believe that as Black people, we should be able to walk to the corner store, get some candy, hashtag Black Lives Matter. And now it has turned into a whole movement. It turned into a whole organization. And so when we think about language, right, that's what we're talking about today, the politics of language. Language here, in the same way that we saw with civil rights and communism, what we see now happening with woke is this same group of anti-communists is using the exact same ploy and the exact same arguments to get us to see woke in a negative light. All right? Oh, I forgot. In 2017, the word woke is added to the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, what I'm about to say is probably the most anti-post-colonialist, anti-whatever liberal thing I could say. However, it is what it is for us as English professors and literary critics. The Oxford English Dictionary is the pinnacle. It is the pinnacle of language, right? If the word is in the Oxford English Dictionary, then it is actually a word. That's how the Literary Academy understands language. That, man, this is a real word if it is in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's another presentation for me to break down the Oxford English Dictionary, all right? So, Oxford English Dictionary includes this word, woke, so it's no longer slang. It's no longer exclusively in Black African American communities. It is in a general mainstream community, and it is defined as being aware of or well-informed in a political or cultural sense. So Oxford even got the definition right. Right? So, once we then delve into woke, what we find is that it's being negatively equated with social entitlement and leftist politics in ways that is not inherent to the use of the word. Okay? The original use of the word, remember, is to simply denote that you should be aware and you should be well informed, maybe about your culture, maybe about your thoughts, beliefs, opinions. But in and of itself, the word is not propelling, propagating, propping up a particular political agenda. In and of itself, the word in its original sense was not doing that. However, because the word is encouraging black people to fight for their rights, it is encouraging black people to do what they can to stay alive, it is encouraging black people to gain a kind of consciousness that causes them to be informed and involved citizens in this democracy, that causes still another socio-political, maybe even revolutionary or radical issue for our government. So what do we see now, right? Woke now is seen as this politicized, problematic term that is seeking to encourage programs and policies that would guilt white people and burden them, inflict psychological and social harm on them, just by me standing here and saying that J. Edgar Hoover opened up 51 FBI files on your favorite black authors, that now is woke. And I'm in here making you all woke, and I'm trying to sway you to my leftist policies, and I want you to vote a particular way. That is the assumption and the fear, right? It's not the truth. That's the fear. So because now we are changing an interpretive community, right, who was not included in the original creation of this term woke, stands on the outside of it and sees that they are threatened in some way. And so because of that perceived threat, they, from their interpretive community, add meaning to a word that was not originally there in the black community, right? So just like we were talking about with Saussure and with Stanley Fish, right? We are putting meaning and significance onto the word because what? Governor DeSantis and many of these other individuals come from communities, come from experiences, so that they cannot read the word and hear the meaning that is not associated with their interpretive community. All right? He sees only his interpretive lens, and so what does he do? Because he is in a position of power, he enacts a policy that is attached to his interpretation of this word. So that we've now got in Florida the Stop Woke Act. Anybody heard of the Stop Woke Act? Got a couple of nods, yes? Yes? So, what is this? The Stop the Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees Act. Having working for the government, like I've just got so many issues with the title. You know what I mean? Like we couldn't brainstorm any longer about just the Stop the Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees Act. Wonderful, Ron. Okay. So in this act, Ron DeSantis is empowering citizens to reject and go after any kind of policy or practice that restricts conversations on race, okay? Because what Ron is saying is that by teaching about race and by articulating anything that would make white people feel guilty about any kind of past wrongdoing to black, brown, or marginalized groups in this country, we are doing them not a disservice, but we are robbing you of your constitutional rights and your constitutional right to not be guilted about racism and America's history needs to be protected. So much so that it would be a civil rights violation if you are studying at an institution of higher learning like this and they bring somebody in like me. It would be a hit to your constitutional right for you to be in a job, in an employment scenario. And maybe because of my job, my day job, I come in and do a training for you and all of your staff. And then I proceed to talk us through the neuroscience behind bias, and I work us through unconscious bias and the history of race and racism in this country. These are all things that are gonna generate for you wrongs that you should not have to be confronted with or deal with. And so woke, for Governor DeSantis in this particular policy, woke is creating rooms, situations, spaces that are so uncomfortable that they are actually dehumanizing. That's what DeSantis is saying. Many of these people who agree with and believe like DeSantis are saying that to be woke, to express woke ideas, is to engage in the dehumanization of white people. That is how they define woke. That is not how even the Oxford Dictionary defines woke. In the same way that the term communist was being equated with civil rights, historical erasure and psychological manipulation of children is being equated with woke. And there, in that is an attempt to create a kind of violence and vilification to conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion that is not present in the terms themselves. Groups in and systems of power will always seek to co-opt and manipulate language in order to control or dismantle resistance movements. So that if I were to really sit and show you, we could go from the slave narrative all the way to the present moment, and I could linguistically show you how African Americans have used language as a means to speak to their humanity, to argue for their place in society, and to actually create and establish policies that reinforce that humanity. And in direct response to that, I can find policies, culture, language, news, media, articles. I can find counter-oppressive language that is suggesting that even the articulation of Black humanity is a kind of violence. So that if we go back to Morrison's speech, and we think about that analogy of the bird in the hand, is it living? Is it dead? I would say that language is very much so alive. Language has the power to create our world. It has the power to destroy our world. It has the power to create equity and equality while simultaneously having the power to perpetuate injustice. It is a living entity. And so the question is not, is language dead? The question more so is, what are you going to do with it? Because it is in your hands. Morrison says this, which is, I think, this is my favorite quote from her. I try to read this at least weekly, and particularly so, just given where we are right now, sociopolitically. And Morrison says, this is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. This is my favorite line. She says, we speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art. Thank you all so much for your time.